I first arrived at the Airbnb lake house in Ontario, I didn't think anything of it, but looking back, that was my first mistake. I'm Matthew Kelly. At the time, I was working 60-hour weeks at a logistics company and burning out fast. I desperately needed a break, somewhere quiet where I could just disconnect for a few days. I found a listing for a secluded A-frame cabin right on the edge of a lake. It was late October, well past peak tourist season, which meant the rental rate was cheap and the surrounding area was completely empty. The drive up took about 4 hours. The last 30 miles were just winding dirt roads cutting through heavy, dark pine forests. By the time I pulled into the gravel driveway, the sun was already starting to set. The cabin looked exactly like the photos. It had a large wooden deck facing the water, massive glass windows, and a heavy solid wood front door. I grabbed the key from the metal lockbox on the porch, let myself in, and locked the deadbolt behind me out of habit. The layout of the cabin was simple. The main floor was essentially one open space, with a kitchen island separating the cooking area from the living room. Down a short, narrow hallway at the back, there was a bathroom and a single bedroom. I brought my duffel bags inside, dropped them on the bedroom floor, and emptied my pockets onto the kitchen island. I clearly remember placing my car keys, my wallet, my sunglasses, and my phone charger right next to the wooden fruit bowl. I spent that first evening just trying to settle in. I unpacked my clothes, made a quick dinner, and sat on the living room couch watching the dark water of the lake. Around 10:30 p.m., my phone battery dipped below 10%. I got up and walked over to the kitchen island to grab my charger. My keys, wallet, and sunglasses were sitting exactly where I left them, but the charger was gone. I stood there looking at the empty spot on the granite counter. I knew for a fact I put it there when I arrived. I figured I must have absent-mindedly moved it while unpacking groceries or making dinner. I spent the next 20 minutes checking my travel bags, looking on the bathroom counter, and scanning the bedroom nightstands. I couldn't find it anywhere. Eventually, I walked back out to the living room. That was when I saw a white cable trailing out from behind the edge of the sofa. I walked over and looked down. My charger was plugged into the lower wall outlet hidden behind the couch. The cord was neatly folded in a tight zigzag pattern and tucked perfectly against the wooden baseboard. I brushed it off. I told myself I must have plugged it in earlier so I could charge my phone while sitting on the couch, and I just completely forgot about it. Travel fatigue can make you do weird things. I unplugged it, charged my phone in the bedroom, and went to sleep. The next morning, the weather was clear and cold. I made a pot of coffee, drank a cup out on the deck, and decided to spend the day hiking a long dirt trail I had passed on the drive up. I went back inside to get ready. I put on my heavy boots, grabbed my car keys, and reached for my sunglasses on the kitchen island. They weren't there. A mild wave of annoyance hit me. I walked into the bedroom, checking the top of the dresser in the unmade bed. I checked the pockets of the jacket I had worn the day before. Nothing. I went out to my car and checked the center console and the floorboards, thinking I might have left them inside when I first arrived. The car was completely empty. I spent nearly 45 minutes tearing the cabin apart. I checked under the couch, on the bathroom sink, even inside the kitchen cabinets just in case I had lost my mind. The sunglasses were simply gone. Feeling frustrated, I gave up and went on my hike without them. The glare off the lake was intense, and I spent the whole afternoon squinting, wishing I had looked harder. I got back to the cabin around 4 p.m., feeling tired and sore. I took my boots off by the front door and walked down the hallway to the bathroom to wash my face. When I pushed the bathroom door open, I froze. My sunglasses were sitting right on top of the closed toilet lid. They weren't just tossed there casually. They were placed exactly in the center of the white lid, facing forward, with the plastic arms folded perfectly flat. I stood in the doorway staring at them. Something felt off. I had been in the bathroom 3 times that morning before I left for the hike. I knew for a fact they hadn't been there, and even if they had been, I would never place my sunglasses perfectly centered on a toilet lid. I felt uneasy. I walked through the entire cabin, checking the locks on the front door and the sliding glass door leading out to the deck. Everything was secured. The windows were all locked from the inside. There was absolutely no sign of a break-in. I tried to convince myself that I was just being incredibly forgetful, that the isolation and the quiet were playing tricks on my memory. but the deliberate, careful placement of the sunglasses kept bothering me. I spent the rest of the evening on edge. I kept the television volume low and listened to the sounds of the house. Aside from the wind outside and the occasional settling of the wooden frame, the cabin was completely quiet. I made sure every single door and window was locked tight before going to bed. The third day was when things went from strange to alarming. I woke up around 8 a.m., took a quick shower, and decided to drive into the nearest town to pick up some extra firewood and groceries. I walked out to the kitchen island to grab my wallet. The island was empty. My stomach dropped. I immediately checked my pants pockets. Empty. I ran back to the bedroom and checked the nightstand, then the bathroom counter, then the coffee table in the living room. No wallet. Panic started to set in. I was entirely alone in a remote area in a different country, and my ID, my credit cards, and all my cash were in that wallet. I spent the next 3 hours conducting a frantic, systematic search of the entire property. I pulled the heavy cushions off the sofa and threw them on the floor. I emptied all my bags onto the bed. I got down on my hands and knees and crawled under the bed frame. I went out to my car and searched under the seats with my phone flashlight. I even walked around the outside perimeter of the cabin, checking the dirt and gravel in case I had dropped it outside. There was absolutely no trace of it. By late afternoon, I was exhausted and deeply stressed. I couldn't drive into town without money, and I couldn't cross the border to get home without my driver's license. I sat on the couch, rubbing my temples, trying to retrace every single step I had taken since I arrived. I clearly remembered seeing the dark brown leather sitting next to my keys the night before. I barely slept that night. I kept waking up to every small noise, convinced I was hearing footsteps walking across the wooden deck or a slow scratching sound near the front door. Every time I got up to check the windows, the outside was pitch black and the cabin was entirely empty. I finally gave up on sleeping and got out of bed for good at 6:30 a.m. The sun wasn't even up yet, leaving the cabin cast in deep gray morning shadows. I walked out of the bedroom and headed down the hallway toward the kitchen to make coffee. I stopped dead in my tracks. My wallet was sitting exactly in the middle of the kitchen island. I slowly walked up to it. It was positioned perfectly parallel to the edge of the granite counter. I reached out and picked it up, my hands shaking slightly. I opened it, fully expecting to find my cash and credit cards gone. Everything was still there. My cards were in their correct slots. My ID was in the clear plastic window. My cash was perfectly intact, but as I looked closer, I noticed a detail that made me feel sick. I always shove my receipts roughly into the cash pocket, leaving them crumpled and messy. Now, every single receipt had been taken out, ironed completely flat and stacked in perfect chronological order by the printed date. The cash bills had also been reorganized, facing the exact same direction, ordered neatly from smallest to largest denomination. Someone had gone through my wallet. Someone had meticulously organized the private contents of it, and then placed it back on the counter while I was sleeping in the other room. I backed away from the kitchen island. The air in the cabin felt suddenly heavy. I realized I was not alone in the house. Whoever was doing this hadn't broken in from the outside. They were already inside with me. I quietly walked down the hallway, grabbing a heavy metal flashlight from my duffel bag. I checked the bathroom. Empty. I checked the bedroom. Empty. The only place left in the hallway was a tall linen closet I hadn't really used since I arrived. I opened the wooden folding door. It was full of extra towels, spare bed sheets, and cleaning supplies. I pushed the towels aside, looking for anything out of place. As I pressed my hand against the back wall of the closet to balance myself, the wooden panel shifted backward. There was a soft, sliding noise. The back wall of the closet wasn't nailed down. It was set on a hidden track. I pushed harder, and the entire panel slid smoothly to the left, revealing a dark, narrow opening. A rush of stale, cold air hit my face. I clicked on my flashlight and shined it into the dark gap. It was a hidden storage space built directly between the hallway and the exterior wall of the cabin. It was barely wide enough for a person to sit up in. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, except for a clear path wiped right down the middle, showing signs of frequent movement. I pointed the beam of light toward the far end of the narrow crawl space. Sitting against the wooden wall was a small, overturned wooden crate acting as a makeshift table. On top of the crate were 3 specific items. I crawled a few feet closer, shining the bright light directly onto them. The first item was a cheap, generic white phone charger. The second was a pair of flimsy plastic aviator sunglasses. The third was a fake brown leather wallet. They were cheap duplicates of the exact items I had brought with me. Whoever was living inside this wall space had been taking my real belongings, temporarily replacing them with these cheap copies on their shelf, and keeping my actual items for hours before returning them slightly altered. My breathing became shallow. I moved the flashlight beam slightly to the left of the fake wallet. Resting flat on the wood, there was a small piece of glossy paper. It looked like a photograph. I reached out and picked it up. It was a Polaroid picture. The colors were slightly washed out, but the image was incredibly clear. It was a photograph of my kitchen island. In the center of the frame, my real brown leather wallet was sitting perfectly parallel to the counter edge. The lighting in the photo was dark gray, meaning the picture had been taken just hours ago, in the early morning light. But it was the angle of the photograph that made my chest completely tighten. The picture hadn't been taken from standing height in the kitchen. It was taken from high above, looking straight down at the granite counter. I stared at the photo, tracing the angle of the shot, and realized exactly where the camera had to have been positioned. I slowly lowered the photograph, backed out of the dark closet, and walked out into the living room. I stopped directly next to the kitchen island and forced myself to look straight up. Directly above the granite counter, set securely into the wooden ceiling, was a dark metal ventilation grate. Would you have checked the vents right away, or would you have just grabbed your keys and run? Everything started off normal at the Airbnb townhouse I rented in Melbourne. Maybe a little too normal. I'm Daniel Jansen. Last year, my company sent me to Australia for a 5-day corporate logistics conference. Instead of staying in one of the crowded downtown hotels surrounded by thousands of other attendees, I decided to find a quiet place in the suburbs. I found a listing for a 2-story townhouse about 20 minutes away from the convention center. The pictures showed a modern, clean space with a large kitchen, a living room, and 2 bedrooms on the second floor. The price was surprisingly low for having the entire place to myself. The only stipulation the host mentioned in the booking message was that the second upstairs bedroom was locked and used for their personal storage. I arrived late on a Sunday evening. The neighborhood was purely residential, consisting of narrow streets and tall, uniform brick houses lined up right next to each other. I used the keypad code to unlock the front door and stepped inside. The house was spotless. The ground floor was just a single open room with the kitchen bleeding into the living area. A set of carpeted stairs led up to a short hallway. My bedroom was at the far end of the hall. The locked door was right next to the bathroom at the top of the stairs. There was a small handwritten sign taped to the wood that just read, "Private." I unpacked my suitcase, took a shower, and went to bed early. The first strange detail happened on Tuesday morning. I woke up around 6 a.m. to get ready for the first day of the conference. I walked downstairs to the kitchen to make some coffee. Sitting in the stainless steel sink was a ceramic mug with a thin ring of dark liquid at the bottom. I stared at it for a few seconds. I hadn't made coffee the night before. In fact, I hadn't used a single dish since I arrived. I had eaten dinner at the airport and just drank bottled water before bed. I tried to rationalize it. I figured the cleaning crew must have left it behind before I checked in, and I simply hadn't noticed it in the dim lighting the night before. I washed the mug, made my own coffee, and left for the day. When I returned that evening, the house was exactly as I had left it. I spent a few hours reviewing notes on my laptop in the living room before heading upstairs. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke up needing to use the bathroom. I stepped out into the dark hallway. As I walked past the locked bedroom, I noticed a faint yellow glow spilling out from the gap beneath the door. I stopped walking. I stood in the dark hallway, watching the strip of light. It wasn't a steady glow like a ceiling fixture. It was shifting slightly, like a small desk lamp or a flashlight moving around. I leaned a little closer to the wood. I heard a soft shuffling noise brushing against the carpet on the other side. I felt uneasy. I assumed the host had come by late at night to grab something from their storage room. It was unprofessional and annoying considering I had rented the entire property, but it wasn't exactly threatening. I didn't want to cause a confrontation in the middle of the night, so I just used the bathroom and went back to my room. I locked my door, lay back in bed, and listened. About 10 minutes later, I heard the faint click of a door closing, followed by the sound of footsteps going down the stairs. The next morning, Wednesday, it was raining heavily. I got dressed, packed my briefcase, and headed downstairs. As I reached the bottom step, I saw something that made me stop completely. There was a trail of wet, muddy footprints leading from the front door, across the hardwood floor, and straight onto the bottom 3 steps of the carpeted stairs. The mud was still damp. I looked at the front door. The deadbolt was still engaged, exactly how I had left it the night before. I didn't own boots that matched that tread pattern, and I hadn't been outside since the rain started. I followed the damp marks with my eyes. They went all the way up the stairs. I slowly walked back up to the second floor. The faint mud stains faded out right in front of the locked storage room. My stomach dropped. Someone wasn't just dropping by to grab items. Someone was coming inside the house from the pouring rain while I was asleep. I stood in front of the locked door and knocked hard on the wood. There was no answer. I grabbed the brass handle and twisted it. It was locked tight. I immediately pulled out my phone and called the host through the rental app. The call rang 4 times and went straight to a generic voicemail. I sent a message demanding to know who had access to the house. I waited for 20 minutes, but there was no response. Since I was already late for my conference presentation, I left the house, making sure to double-check the front door lock behind me. I couldn't focus at all that day. I kept checking my phone, waiting for an explanation, but the host never replied. I decided I was going to pack my things and find a hotel that evening, regardless of the cost. I got back to the townhouse around 7 p.m. The rain had stopped, but the sky was overcast and dark. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was silent. I walked upstairs to my room, pulled my suitcase out of the closet, and started throwing my clothes into it. I wanted to be out of there within the hour. While I was packing, I heard a heavy metallic click coming from downstairs. It was the sound of the front door deadbolt sliding open. I froze, holding a stack of shirts. I heard the door hinges whine, followed by the heavy thud of the door closing shut. Then came the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, heavy steps walking across the hardwood floor of the living room. I slowly backed away from my bedroom door. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. They started coming up. The floorboards creaked under the weight. I stood completely still in the center of my room, barely breathing. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs, walked down the short hallway, and stopped right outside my bedroom door. I watched the shadow of 2 feet appear in the gap under my door. They stood there for what felt like an eternity. I didn't make a sound. Finally, the shadow shifted. The footsteps moved to the left, stopping in front of the locked room. I heard the distinct sound of a key sliding into a lock. The metal turned, the handle clicked, and the door opened. A few seconds later, it closed and locked again from the inside. Whoever was in there had a key to the house, and they were completely ignoring the fact that I was renting the space. I didn't want to confront them. I just wanted to leave. I grabbed my suitcase, quietly unlocked my bedroom door, and stepped out into the hallway. As I walked past the locked door, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The townhouse had a small, narrow balcony attached to the back of the second floor. The glass door to access it was at the far end of the hallway. I looked out through the glass and saw a second sliding door leading directly into the locked bedroom from the outside balcony. It wasn't completely shut. There was a 1-inch gap leaving it open to the night air. Curiosity and anger overtook my fear. I quietly opened the hallway door, stepped out onto the cold balcony, and crept over to the cracked sliding door. The curtains inside were drawn, but there was a slight opening in the fabric. I leaned in and looked through the glass. The room wasn't a storage space at all. It was completely empty of boxes or furniture, except for a stained mattress laying directly on the floor. There were dirty blankets piled on top of it, and a cluster of empty takeout food containers stacked against the wall. But what made me stop breathing was what was hanging on the opposite wall. It was a large, cheap paper calendar. The month of my stay was displayed. Every single date of my reservation was heavily circled in thick red marker. Beneath the calendar, sitting on a small plastic folding chair, was a black duffel bag and a pile of small, familiar items. I squinted through the glass to get a better look. Sitting on the chair was my spare phone charging cable, a pair of my socks, and the travel-sized bottle of cologne I had left sitting on my bathroom counter. Someone wasn't just sleeping in this room. They had been freely walking through the house while I was sleeping, taking small items, and returning to their locked space. I kept looking through the gap in the curtains, trying to see the person who had just walked in. The room was illuminated by a single-floor lamp, casting long shadows against the walls. I scanned the corners, the mattress, the closet. The room was empty. There was no one inside. I stood perfectly still on the balcony, the cold wind hitting my face. The realization hit me all at once. The footsteps I heard coming up the stairs hadn't gone into the locked room. They had simply turned the key from the outside to make it sound like they did. Before I could move, I heard a slow, heavy creaking sound coming from the wooden floorboards directly behind me, inside my own bedroom. If you found out someone was secretly living in your rental property, would you try to catch them or just leave immediately? It was around my second morning at a modern Airbnb in Seattle when I first started noticing something was off, and it only got worse from there. I'm George Burton. Last November, my company sent me to Washington to oversee a 2-week software rollout. Instead of staying in a hotel for half a month, I rented a high-end apartment right near downtown Seattle. The building was one of those massive glass and steel high-rises where you rarely ever see your neighbors. The elevator required a scanned key fob to even access the residential floors, which gave me a strong sense of security at first. The hallways were heavily carpeted, deadening all outside sound, so when you were inside the apartment, you felt completely cut off from the rest of the building. The apartment itself was essentially a luxury studio. It had wide plank hardwood floors, exposed concrete pillars, and massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city streets. The front door was a heavy, solid-core security door. Instead of a standard lock and keyhole, it had a sleek, matte black digital keypad on the outside and a motorized thumb turn on the inside. When the deadbolt engaged, it made a loud, distinct mechanical grinding noise that echoed through the small entryway. The host hadn't met me in person. They just sent an automated message on the day of my arrival with instructions to download a specific smart home application. I had to create an account, verify my email, and pair my phone via Bluetooth to gain entry. Inside the apartment, mounted to the wall right next to the front door, was a digital touchscreen tablet. It controlled the lights, the heating, and displayed the status of the smart lock. My first night there was completely uneventful. I unpacked my bags, ordered some food, and went to sleep early. The next morning, I woke up around 7 a.m. I reached over to the nightstand and unplugged my phone. As the screen lit up, I saw a single push notification from the smart home app waiting on the lock screen. Front door unlocked at 3:14 a.m. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the text. I was completely alone in the apartment. I hadn't gotten up during the night, and I certainly hadn't unlocked the door. I walked out of the bedroom area, down the short entryway, and looked at the lock. The circular indicator ring around the thumb turn was glowing red, meaning it was currently secured. I reached out and manually tested the heavy metal handle just to be absolutely sure. It didn't budge. I figured it had to be a delayed notification from when I arrived the day before, or some kind of minor software glitch in the network. I swiped the notification away, got dressed, and left for the corporate office downtown. The second day, I was busy at work and mostly forgot about it. But when I returned to the high-rise that evening, the long, identical gray doors of the 14th floor hallway felt much less welcoming. I used my phone to unlock the door, stepped inside, and immediately pushed the lock icon on the interior wall panel. I heard the heavy bolt slide into the frame. I even pulled hard on the metal handle to ensure it was physically secured. The next morning, I woke up just before 7 a.m. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand. There were 2 new push notifications on the screen. Front door unlocked at 2:45 a.m. Front door locked at 2:48 a.m. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a delayed notification. The lock had physically disengaged for 3 minutes in the middle of the night and then re-engaged. Someone or something had opened the deadbolt while I was sleeping less than 30 feet away. I felt deeply uneasy. I quickly walked to the apartment, checking the bathroom, the closet, and the kitchen. Nothing was out of place. My work laptop was still sitting on the kitchen island, and my wallet was exactly where I had left it. The door leading out to the hallway was completely shut. I opened the security app on my phone and dug into the settings menu. I navigated to the keypad options and generated a brand new entry code, instantly deleting the temporary one the host had assigned me. Then, I sent a direct message to the host through the rental app. I explained the late-night notifications and asked if there was any automated system or building staff that had remote access to the lock. About 2 hours later, the host replied. It was a brief, dismissive message. They said it was a known firmware issue with that specific brand of smart lock. They claimed the system would occasionally send false status updates to the app and told me not to worry about it. I tried to accept that explanation, but something felt off. I spent the rest of the day feeling distracted. I decided I would stay awake that night and watch the door myself. When I got back to the apartment, I locked the deadbolt, checked it twice, and made myself a pot of coffee. Instead of going to bed, I sat at the kitchen island with my laptop. The way the apartment was laid out, sitting at the island gave me a direct line of sight down the short entryway to the front door. I worked quietly for a few hours. The city outside eventually grew quiet, and the apartment was completely silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. It was exactly 1:15 a.m. Then, I heard a sharp electronic beep. It came from the front door. I looked up from my screen. There was a slow mechanical grinding noise. It was the distinct sound of the heavy metal cylinder sliding backward into the door frame. The red LED ring around the lock suddenly flashed, turned solid green, and let out a soft confirmation chime. The deadbolt was open. I froze. I sat completely still on the kitchen stool, staring down the entryway. I kept my eyes locked on a heavy metal handle, waiting for it to turn. I expected the door to swing open, but it didn't. Nothing happened. The green light just stayed illuminated, casting a faint glow against the dark wall. After about 10 seconds, I slowly stood up. I walked quickly down the entryway and slammed the palm of my hand against the digital keypad, forcing the deadbolt to slide back into the locked position. The light immediately turned red. I leaned forward and pressed my eye against the peephole. The hallway outside was brightly lit. I had a clear view in both directions. The corridor was completely empty. There was no one standing out there. Whoever was unlocking my door wasn't doing it from the keypad in the hallway. They were doing it remotely. I turned away from the door and looked at the digital touchscreen tablet mounted on the wall. The screen was dark. I tapped the glass to wake it up. The home screen showed the current temperature and the lock status. I didn't want to use the app on my phone anymore. I wanted to see the main system panel. I pressed the settings icon in the bottom corner of the screen. A prompt appeared asking for an administrator PIN. I didn't have one, but I tried the factory default. I typed 1234. The screen flashed white and opened the core system settings. I didn't know much about networking, but the interface was incredibly simple. I navigated through the menus until I found a tab labeled Access and Users and tapped it. A short list loaded on the screen, showing the accounts that had authorized access to the apartment's lock. The first account was labeled Host Main. That made sense. The second account was simply labeled Admin2. It didn't have a phone number, an email address, or a device name attached to it. It was completely anonymous. I tapped on the Admin2 profile. A secondary menu appeared with an option labeled Activity History. I pressed it. The screen went blank for a second before populating with a long list of dates and timestamps. I looked at the very top of the list. It showed the exact event that had just occurred. 10:15 a.m. unlocked by a network. Below that was the previous night. 2:45 a.m. unlocked by a network. 2:48 a.m. locked by a network. 2:48 a.m. locked by a network. This was the account controlling the door. I kept scrolling down the screen. The list went on and on. I started to notice a pattern in the dates. The activity would happen for 3 or 4 days in a row, then stop for a week, then happen again for a weekend. The active dates perfectly matched a standard short-term rental schedule. I scrolled back through 3 months, then 6 months, then an entire year. The pattern never broke. I stood alone in the quiet apartment, staring down at the glowing screen. There were hundreds of entries spanning the last 12 months. Every single one of them showed the front door being remotely unlocked between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., while the guests inside were completely asleep. Would you have confronted the host with the logs? Or would you have just packed your things and left immediately?